Hi guys, and welcome to another episode in a video series presented by KupoCon, where I'll be exploring the Final Fantasy VII compilation lore and Easter eggs that appear in the remake. I'm MJ Gallagher, author of the unofficial Final Fantasy VII Novelisation, the standalone novel The Nibelheim Incident, which is now an audio series also produced by KupoCon, and the forthcoming book Norse Myths that inspired Final Fantasy VII. The purpose of this series is to discuss a lot of the detail hidden within the remake, and to provide a broader understanding for new and casual fans alike. In the last episode, I spoke in depth about Chapter 7 of the game, A Trap is Sprung, which covers Cloud, Barret and Tifa's infiltration of Mako Reactor 5, their confrontation with President Shinra, and the battle against the Airbuster. This time around, I'll be breaking down the first part of Chapter 8, titled Budding Bodyguard. This chapter is crammed to the rafters with lore, so I've divided it into not one, but 3 episodes. They will each inherently include spoilers for this section of the game, but anything beyond Chapter 8 is minimal and mainly speculation. However, as always, if you're not familiar with the original story, there will likely be very heavy spoilers. The chapter opens with a sequence inside Cloud's mind, which, just as it does in the old game, bridges the gap between his fall from the plate and him regaining consciousness. We catch a glimpse of the mysterious spectres from earlier in the remake, but it's unclear if the suggestion here is that they have helped cushion his 300-metre plummet, if they are guiding his subconscious, or if it simply references their imminent reappearance. Given that the dialogue in the corresponding section of the original game was text only, and the identity of the second voice is not revealed, fans speculated for years on who it might be. Some, myself included, believed it to be Zack. Others argued it was Sephiroth. It was only with the release of the Final Fantasy VII Ultimania Omega that developers confirmed it to be the voice of Cloud's real self, providing support to the fragile mind of our protagonist. The ambiguity is removed in the remake by having both Clouds shown on screen, though it does initially tease the possibility of it being the Zack part of his psyche. It's also worth noting that the music playing in the background is a new, softer version of the track Who Am I?, which typically accompanied scenes in the original where Cloud's mental state becomes fractured. Curiously, Cloud does speak the line "Who are you?", which happens to be the name of the other track that plays when he's conversing with himself in the old game. And while Sephiroth's intrusion here may also be a reference to the pre-Ultimania Omega fan theories, it's primarily a reminder that Cloud is still carrying around the traumatising memory of his nemesis. As before, Cloud wakes up amid the flower bed in the Sector 5 Slum Church. We see sunlight pouring through the stained glass windows, and a new hole in the roof, signifying that at least an hour has passed since the nighttime encounter with the Airbuster. The girl from Chapter 2 has been watching over him, and of course introduces herself as Aerith, not the mistranslated preset name of Eris in the original, controversial as it is. The dialogue continues with Cloud indicating he doesn't immediately recognise her, but she acts offended that he hasn't remembered. This does mirror the old version, but also alludes to one of the more famous dialogue options where the player can call Aerith the Slum Drunk. She goes on to explain that Cloud had come crashing through the roof, which, chronologically, is the second time it has happened in the compilation. To create a parallel between Cloud's relationship with Aerith and Zack's relationship with Aerith, writer Kazushige Nojima included a similar scene in Crisis Core, where Zack fell from Mako Reactor 5 into the flower bed after confronting his former mentor, Angeal. It ultimately resulted in a romance between the young girl and the black-haired soldier, which is repeatedly referenced in coming chapters. I should point out that there is also a third instance where someone has plunged onto the flower bed from a slightly less high height. While trying to protect Aerith from the militant wing of Avalanche in episode 11 of Before Crisis, the player Turk is chased into the church's rafters by the enemy and is knocked from a ledge by Shears, one of the organisation's commanders. Again, the flowers break their fall. Aerith then changes the conversation to the so-called useless materia she owns, triggering a vision in Cloud's mind. This is extremely important with regards to the remake's plot, but I'll return to the subject later in the episode. After the chat, Cloud is granted the opportunity to explore the church a bit. There's so much detail here, and it's just a joy to behold for the sentimental fans among us. Aerith eventually returns to tending the flowers, just as she does in the original game when Reno first enters through the doorway. She playfully tries to guilt trip Cloud by commenting it's only her looking after them, which may be a little allusion to Crisis Core. Zack spends a lot of time at the church during that game, helping Aerith with various things, most notably the flower cart he builds for her. Cloud's arrival and aesthetic similarities to Zack in terms of his old soldier uniform and the large broadsword he carries would no doubt bring back fond memories. Some players may have missed this, but if you walk to the main doorway, you can hear Reno outside instructing the security officers to hang back, as they're not in a hurry. This is a little nod to the original, as if you try to speak with the redhead immediately after he shows up at the church, he tells Cloud not to pay him any heed. There's also a deeper meaning in the line though, because the Turks are very deliberately not rushing to kidnap Aerith, but I'll explain that more in detail soon. Before we move on, I'm going to shift the topic of lore to something a bit more abstract, something for the compilation purists. Because of its association with Aerith, the Sector 5 church has become a landmark of the Final Fantasy VII universe. But have you ever wondered which god or gods were worshipped here? There's no real answer ever provided in the compilation, but there are a few pieces of evidence that we can speculate on. Perhaps the most obvious is that while the stained glass windows include nothing of value, there is a religious symbol that can be seen above the altar. One could argue it bears a similarity to a Christian cross with a halo on top, or that it has 6 points like the Jewish Star of David. The word church itself specifically relates to a building used for Christian worship. Both Christianity and Judaism believe in a single God, who sometimes has multiple facets, and presides over the eternal paradise of heaven. This concept should not exist in-game because of how separate it is to the known workings of spirit energy and the livestream, but Sid actually makes reference to such a god in the official novella On the Way to a Smile. The religious symbol itself does appear elsewhere in the compilation, but only in one place, Calm Cathedral. This is a location from Dirge of Cerberus, and while it's pretty challenging to see during Vincent's battle with the deep ground helicopter, the cathedral spire is topped with the symbol. This can most clearly be viewed from the concept artwork that accompanied the international release of the game, but it also showed up in the building's interior during some of the Calm missions in the Japanese-only Dirge of Cerberus Online. It could therefore be claimed that the symbol and or the religion it represents is localised to this region. The original Final Fantasy VII contained numerous Judeo-Christian themes, ranging from Sephiroth's name being derived from Hebrew texts, to Jenova's name being the amalgamation of Jehovah, the Hebrew god, and Nova, the Latin word for new, hence new god. Similarly, Safer Sephiroth's design is based on the Seraphim, which are the highest rank of angels. Vincent Valentine has a constant desire to repent for his sins. And of course there's the Promised Land, which was also the name of the fabled place God instructed Moses to lead the Jews. It stands to reason then that these themes would also influence the Sector 5 church. Another possibility is that the 6 points of the cross represent the standard Final Fantasy elements of fire, ice, earth, wind, lightning and water, with the halo at its pinnacle referencing holy, either in a generic elemental sense or in the specific Final Fantasy VII context. This would also tie into the historic relationship between the Cetra and the summoned creatures, which I'll talk about in a later episode. The third, and in my opinion most probable theory based on the wider compilation, is that worship of a god at this church is actually an extension of Cetran ideologies. We know that the Cetra worshipped and communed with the planet, and that humans replaced them after their numbers dwindled following the Great Calamity 2000 years ago. As with our own world, religious concepts and dogmas can be traced back through various cultures, so it would make sense that Final Fantasy VII's modern humans had been influenced by the Cetra. It's revealed in Crisis Core that the will of the planet is embodied and carried out by Minerva, who appears as the game's secret boss under the epithet of the Reigning God. Therefore, just as the Cetra worshipped the planet, it's possible humans worshipped Minerva, the very personification of the planet. One fan hypothesis that bolsters this argument is that the climax of Crisis Core shows the goddess to be connected to Benora, the site where dumb apples have the mysterious strength to ripen out of season. The existence of Benora white apple juice in the remake is established at the beginning of Chapter 1, on a poster inside the train station. So when Aerith remarks in this chapter that the flowers are tougher than they look, and that this place has a special kind of power, it's very possible she senses Minerva's presence here as well. Furthermore, as a descendant of the Cetra herself, it would certainly explain Aerith's deep connection to the church. When Cloud at last responds to Aerith's attempts at a guilt trip, Reno and a few officers stride into the nave. The Turk asks who Cloud is, and Aerith answers by identifying him as a soldier and her bodyguard. We already know she is familiar with soldiers, so that's hardly out of place, but to refer to him as a bodyguard, and soon after a mercenary, does raise a few questions. I'll come back to this point though. Despite his confusion, Cloud still has the presence of mind to advise that it will cost her. She negotiates a price of exactly 1 date, which, as well as paralleling the original game's script, is also a line from Crisis Core, where Zack proposes that Aerith's reward for looking after him when he crashes into the church is, you guessed it, 1 date. Anyway, Reno immediately calls bullshit on Cloud being an ex-soldier first class. While he acknowledges his Mako-infused eyes, he clearly does not recognise the boy, which is kinda weird because the Turks spent a chunk of the last year searching for Zack and Cloud, after they escaped the basement laboratory of Nibelheim's Shinra Manor. Towards the climax of Crisis Core, Reno and Rude were directly involved in pursuing the fugitives, and are shown looking for them in a helicopter above the Midgar wastelands. Though their primary target was Zack, it would be unusual for a Turk to be unaware of the secondary target. Curious. When the skirmish in the church kicks off, Reno remarks that he is also one of Aerith's bodyguards. She claims this is the first she's hearing of it, and Reno retorts that it's because it's a classified op. It's a short exchange, but it does carry a lot of compilation lore. Veteran fans will know that the organisation has been monitoring her for well over a decade. Contrary to Reno's aggressive pursuit during the corresponding scene in the old game though, the compilation is fairly explicit that part of the Turks' remit is to protect Aerith. Zack even entrusts her safety to Sung in Crisis Core before he leaves for the fateful Nibelheim mission. A brief insight into the wider circumstances is provided at the end of episode 11 in Before Crisis, where Sung reveals to the player Turk that he genuinely believes Aerith's cooperation with the company would benefit the world, but that he won't force her to return to Shinra. However, it's unclear if this is because of his feelings towards her, or that it would be detrimental to their long-term goal. During the initial battle with the security officers, Reno comically sits halfway up one of the columns to watch. He goes on to personally challenge Cloud, exhibiting lightning-quick movements and running up Cloud's sword in an action sequence that has been lifted straight out of director Tetsuya Nomura's playbook. It's not particularly obvious in either the original Final Fantasy VII or in Advent Children, but Reno's greatest asset is his tremendous speed. This is explored better in Before Crisis, where he is a mentor to the player characters and is recognised by allies and enemies alike as bearing the title Fastest of the Turks. Similarly, his partner Rude enjoys the moniker Strongest of the Turks. There are a couple of little throwbacks to Reno's previous battle design, such as his casual stance with the electromagnetic rod on his shoulder, or his attempts to trap Cloud in an electromagnetic field, just like his pyramid attack in the original game. As for his aesthetic design however, that's changed a bit. Much was made of the Turks' character renders prior to the remake's release, primarily in relation to how their suits had been personalised. In Reno's case, his unbuttoned shirt has made a return, but it appears significantly less untidy now. Perhaps the biggest difference some fans may have forgotten about is that the Turks' suits in the old game were dark blue, not black. The change was introduced for the 2004 release of Before Crisis and reaffirmed in Advent Children in 2005. With the exception of Vincent's flashback to his Turks days in Dirge of Cerberus, every version of their suits has been black since. Cloud is eventually successful in knocking Reno to the ground and stands over his weakened opponent, sword raised in preparation to strike the fatal blow. He hesitates when Aerith yells for him to stop, and the hooded spectres suddenly materialise to protect the Turk, hurling our protagonists into the rear of the church. If you recall my episode covering the Remake's Chapter 5 and the tail end of Chapter 4, I spoke at length about how these entities seem to act in a way that ensures the events of the original game come to pass. The example I gave was how Jessie's injury led to Cloud being recruited at the last minute to participate in the bombing mission to Mako Reactor 5. Preventing Cloud from killing Reno here is an even more extreme example. Not only do the pair not fight at the church in the old game, to slay the Turk now would likely derail what happens at the Sector 7 pillar. We already know how devastating and tragic that incident will be, so it begs the question of whether the Spectre's agenda is good, evil, or indifferent. The layout to this part of the church is pretty dissimilar to the original, but as Cloud and Aerith begin to climb the stairs, veteran fans may be able to spot a few references. One of these is the giant rusted shell of a rocket that smashed through the exterior wall years earlier. In both the old game and remake, Aerith slides down this after she is shot at by the pursuing troops. Believe it or not, there's actually a bit of history here. During the original, if you speak to Cid aboard the Highwind after the party activates the secret fountain at the Forgotten Capital, he will say the following. That reminds me, there was a test rocket that landed in the slums of Midgar long ago. I remember I was relieved when I heard it never blew up. We know that Cid was a famous Shinra pilot before being selected to fly the company's first rocket into space, and thus would be privy to disastrous launches. What you see here is the very test rocket he was referring to. The remake has apparently added even more detail to that little story, but I'll come back to it in the next episode. As Cloud and Aerith ascend through this area, one of the stone balustrades crumbles beneath the weight of the flower girl. To their surprise, the spectres catch her and safely return her to the balcony. This supports Aerith's earlier comment about them no longer attacking her, as they were doing in Chapter 2, which raises the question of why they were attacking her on Loveless Street. If we accept the principle that the hooded ghosts are acting to preserve the continuity of the original game, just what the hell was Aerith doing previously that they didn't like? This is something I want you to keep in mind as the video series progresses. As just one of several occasions during the remake where a character extends a hand to help another, Cloud pauses to help Aerith across the plank. This is very likely an allusion to the ending of the old game where Aerith reaches out from the livestream, or similar scenes in Advent Children. The moment is spoiled, however, when the security officers open fire on the pair. What's interesting here is that Reno reprimands the trooper for it, warning him that there better not be a scratch on the girl. This is a 180-degree retcon from the original, because there it's Reno who gives the order in the first place, and even casually wonders if the gunshots have killed Aerith. The whole event was previously a little minigame where Cloud had to push barrels from the rafters to take out the officers. There's an homage to this in the remake, where our hero cuts down a chandelier to drop it on one of the men. As Cloud and Aerith make their way across the rafters of the nave, the camera angle allows them to watch Reno and his cronies leave. It's only when the Shinra personnel exit the church that the circling spectres vanish, reiterating the concept that they are actively trying to protect all three characters from each other. If the player retraces their steps at this time, they are granted the opportunity to examine the hole in the ceiling made by Cloud's plunge from the reactor. What's also worth noting here is that Cloud and Aerith escape through a gap on the west side of the roof in the remake, while they escape through a cavity on the east side in the original game. I expect this is purely for environment mechanics, but you can still see the old hole here. As I've spoken about many times already in this series, it would seem almost no detail has been overlooked by the remake's developers, and there are so many subtle references hidden in plain sight. Another example in this chapter are the barrels resting over the hole in the attic floor, perfect for kicking down onto Shinra troops in the minigame I mentioned earlier. Stepping outside, the daylight spilling through the unfinished Sector 6 plate is absolutely glorious. Aerith points out a destination for them, then asks if they should mosey on over. Cloud replies with "let's," which is a direct reference to his iconic line from the original, when the team prepares to make their final descent into the heart of the northern crater. After awkwardly trying to motivate his comrades by saying, "Alright everyone, let's mosey," Cloud is berated by Cid for being too wimpy. Before climbing down the ladders here, if the player spins the camera around, they'll be afforded a glimpse of the religious symbol on the church's apex. It's slightly different to the version above the altar in the nave, with the addition of a circle at its centre. Make of that what you will. Having played through the entirety of Final Fantasy VII Remake, I can honestly say that Cloud and Aerith's little jaunt across the shanty rooftops is in my top 3 favourite scenes. From the music to the dialogue to the utterly spectacular visuals, it's just oozing with nostalgia, and Aerith's quirky charisma really shines through. The section is very faithful to the old game, but brings the area and conversation to life in new ways. Producer Yoshinori Kitase has referred to this scene during many interviews as a way of explaining the development team's desire to expand on the original, showcasing details that were impossible to include before due to the pre-rendered backgrounds. I'd like to use this time to return to a couple of subjects I mentioned earlier in the episode. These are respectively Aerith identifying Cloud as a mercenary, and also Cloud's visions of the future. I spoke in episode 2 about the remake being unclear on whether or not Aerith recognises the Buster Sword. During the events of Crisis Core, Zack inherits the blade from Angeal. There are several months between Zack's return from Medeoheim, where he was forced to slay his old soldier mentor, and being sent off to Nibelheim. There's even an entire chapter set in this time window dedicated to Zack helping to build Aerith a flower cart. It's highly unlikely, therefore, that she did not learn of the sword's importance. Combining this with Cloud's attire and crested belt, it makes perfect sense why Aerith would assume he was connected to Soldier. What makes less sense though is how she would guess he was a mercenary based on his weapon, whether he's equipped with the Buster Sword or otherwise. It's of course possible that muscle for hire is commonplace in the slums, particularly in Don Corneo's neck of the woods, but Aerith's comments follow those from Chapter 2, where she insists on giving Cloud a flower that represents lovers being reunited. The suggestion here is that she is aware on some level of her relationship to the Cloud in the old game. Whether something is causing this or it's another of her enigmatic Cetran gifts, the mystery deepens with each passing chapter. It's also worth noting that the secret Zack flashback in the original Final Fantasy VII shows the black-haired soldier's intention of returning to Midgar as a mercenary and seeking out his old girlfriend. Could this perhaps be something Aerith has sensed? Only time will tell. As for the second subject I wanted to address, it's separate to the first point, but still connected. Back in the church, when Aerith mentions her special materia and shows Cloud the pink hair ribbon where she keeps it, he has a vision of the altar at the Forgotten Capital. It depicts Aerith praying and her white materia bouncing into the water below, an ominous sight for old fans. The footage of course has been lifted directly from Advent Children, but this is the second time in the remake that Cloud has glimpsed future events. The first being during his contact with Marco, where he sees cloaked figures gathering at the reunion. What's curious here is that visions of the future have been newly introduced for Cloud in the remake. There is at least one instance in the compilation that sets a precedent for this though, and that occurs in Dirge of Cerberus, where Lucrezia has flashes of what her son Sephiroth will become. This torturous foresight is attributed to the high concentration of Genova cells in her body. Cloud too has had his genetic makeup modified by Genova cells, so it's possible those are the trigger, but I personally suspect something else is the cause. With Aerith's references to the original game, Cloud's visions of the future, and the hooded spectres actively preventing dramatic plot changes, there's a lot more going on here than meets the eye. Reaching the summit of the derelict tower, the duo are afforded a jaw-dropping panorama of the surrounding environment. The Sector 5 slums differ somewhat from Sector 7 on topography alone, but the volume of sunlight also makes a huge difference. Speaking of, there's another great detail the developers have included here that is really easy to overlook. Various maps of Midgar have appeared in the compilation materials, but they all agree that the border between Sectors 1 and 8 faces due north. That means the border between Sectors 6 and 7 faces due east. This corresponds with the direction of the characters' shadows in Chapter 8, because the sun is presumably rising in the east. One significant change some fans probably picked up on is the design of the church's exterior. In the original, the building boasted a single bell tower rising from its main facade, whereas here we see a pair. This actually reflects the design that appeared in Advent Children Complete, albeit the eastern tower currently has its spire intact. The hole in the roof that Cloud and Aerith emerged from is also relatively similar to one seen in the sequel movie, but a notable difference to the original church is that the slate tiles here are blue, despite previously being burgundy in colour. And while we're on the topic of holes in the roof, from this position, if you look closely, you can view the skywalks on the plate that extend from the Sector 5 reactor. This of course is where the Airbuster battle took place at the end of Chapter 7, and ultimately where Cloud was thrown from the plate. But why is it so far away? Even if we accept the fantastical notion that a superhuman soldier can survive a 300-metre plummet thanks to a flower bed, I vividly recall Cloud falling directly downward. This is yet another mystery for us to speculate on. Adjacent to the church are the crumbled ruins of other buildings which, at a glance, may not seem important, but these present a veiled window into Midgar's past. The structures themselves could have been anything from a school to an apartment block to business offices. It's difficult to tell now. You might recall the train scene in the original game where Jessie shows Cloud a 3D map of the city, and she states that the 8 sectors used to be individual towns, but no one can remember their names. It would be unusual to have an archaic church without it being accompanied by old-fashioned architecture, such as in Calm. So what you're seeing here are likely the remnants of a town that existed before Midgar. And finally, to round up the first episode in my trilogy covering Chapter 8, I'm going to talk a little more in depth about some of Aerith's scenes from Crisis Core and before Crisis. When Cloud first pulls the Flower Girl up onto the rusting tower, she remarks that she can see the wall. Aerith is referring here to the city boundary, a lofty concrete perimeter that functioned primarily as a game mechanic in the original to prevent the player re-entering Midgar after they had reached the world map. Triggering a short cutscene at this time will prompt Aerith to reflect on how she thought about leaving the city once, but couldn't bring herself to do it. This is the basic premise for the plot of episode 11 in Before Crisis. In that episode, Aerith is a 17-year-old who tries to sneak away from home in the middle of the night because she is compelled to go on a journey to see what life is like outside of Midgar. She's soon captured by Avalanche troops and brought before the faction's leaders, Elfie, Shears and Fajito, at the church. They try to coax the location of the Promised Land from her and insist that she should escape the watchful eye of Shinra. In the end, Aerith decides that she doesn't want to leave her mother or the flowers, which loosely connects to her admission in the remake that the outside world seems overwhelming. She goes on to talk about how most people in the slums hate the steel sky, which is a euphemism for the plate, but she doesn't. This is actually an extension of some dialogue she shares with Zack in Crisis Core during their first day together. In that scene, Aerith admits that the real sky frightens her. She says it makes her feel like it's sucking her in, though it's unclear where this fear originated from. My guess is that it has something to do with her and Ifalna's flight from Shinra headquarters. Anyway, Zack promises to take Aerith to see the real sky one day, and it's this desire to reconnect with him that eventually gives her the confidence to sell flowers on the plate. Ironically, thanks to the gap in Sector 6's construction overhead, the Remake's creators have made the church the best place to see the natural sky in all the slums. Well everyone, this has been part 1 of my recap of the compilation lore and Easter eggs from Chapter 8 in the Final Fantasy VII Remake. I hope you've enjoyed it, and please be sure to leave a comment with any feedback or something you think I've missed. If you haven't already done so, I invite you to check out my own Patreon account, where you'll find free downloads of my unofficial novelisation of Final Fantasy VII, the Nibelheim incident, and much more. Subscribers also get access to a huge amount of original content as well, including project artwork, behind the scenes podcasts, mythology articles, etc. And be sure to look out for my new book, Norse Myths That Inspired Final Fantasy VII, which releases later in the year. But until next time, take care. I'm MJ Gallagher, in association with KupoCon, and I'll speak to you again soon.